All right, welcome back, everybody. Really looking forward to our next panel, which is called Ransomware Attacks Before and After, Preparation, Governance, Training, and Remediation. And let me start by introducing our moderator, Aravind Swaminathan, a partner at
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, let's. I'm going to make the executive decision to kick Bruce out. He may never invite me to this panel again, but we'll try that. So, welcome everybody. I think Bruce told you what the panel is. Let's go around the room and just let everybody introduce themselves. Luke, do you want to go first and just tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Aravind, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Luke Dembosky. I co-lead the global data strategy and security practice at Debevoise in Plimpton. And before that was many years a federal prosecutor at the Justice Department focused on cyber crimes.
Awesome. Dan?
Hi, all. Dan Greene from Beckage. I'm the practice group lead for our incident response practice. Before that, amongst a couple of other things, I was also a federal defender. So I had the honor of going up against some of my esteemed colleagues here. It's great to be here today.
Nice. Thanks, Dan. And then Chris.
Well, I guess I'm the only one with no law enforcement experience here, but Chris Ballod, everybody. I'm an associate managing director at Kroll Cyber, where I lead incident response teams and also get involved with some proactive things like security assessments and things like that. Before that, I was an attorney where I practiced in data privacy and cybersecurity handling. You guessed it, incident response. So never had the pleasure of going up against any of these gentlemen, which is probably a good thing. They seem like they're good at what they do.
Awesome. All right. So let's just jump into it and kind of talk. So we're going to talk about preparation, governance, training, and remediation. There's not a lot we're not going to talk about. And we're going to try to cram in a couple things. But maybe, Chris, let me just start with you. Just from a prep standpoint, because I know you're sit down with a lot of clients working on how to get ready. Let's just start with what's the one first thing you think that's most helpful in thinking about how you prep for a ransomware situation?
Yeah, the first thing is, frankly, communication, getting them to understand who owns what and how critical things are. So the stakeholders and the assets, if they don't know what they have to protect, they can't protect it to begin with. And that's a major kind of a major issue, is how do you educate an organization about what their risks are if they don't really know what they hold that's sensitive, and then who needs to be called, what, where, when, why. One of the examples I always like to give is, if you just spent $25,000 getting an incident response plan, that's great, but why are you keeping it under lock and key so that only two people who sleep, like humans do, know how to get a hold of it and can? So a lot of really practical thought of first identifying the what and then the who. And really, I like to approach it by going through kind of a demonstrating scoping call. Pretend you've just been hit by ransomware. What does it look like now? And who's calling whom? That's really where I get started.
Yeah, let's pick up on that. So Luke, just your thoughts on sort of like the OPSEC issues, right? So bad guys in the network has dropped ransomware, right? And just, and then tie it into preparation, right? You have a potential OPSEC problem, right? In terms of Chris is saying let's communicate, you could just, I'll just email everybody. Well, that might not be secure. So Luke, a little bit about how you think through preparation from an operational security standpoint. And I guess this applies to every intrusion, but so ransomware is not necessarily ransomware specific, but I think it's a good thought to touch on here, given what Chris has said.
No, it's a great question. I mean, it really, all the governance things that we'll talk about later are definitely in play. This is like testing all muscle groups, ransomware, everything from security to BCP and DR to even privacy issues, as these groups take data in almost every case now. But as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of, working overseas in an embassy, in my case, in Russia, and people that work for companies overseas. They're trained to have prepared a go bag, and so they have a change of clothes, they've got some cash, they've got an alternate communications method. If there's an emergency plan, they've got a copy of it in that bag, and they can literally go. So as you think about the tactical things you asked about, Aravind, do I have a copy of my plan printed out, or is it in the now encrypted, laptop or network? Do I have a copy of my insurance policy in a paper form, accessible, even at my home office, for example? From a technical standpoint, we see all the time cases where people's only copy of their Active Directory that they authenticate users into the network is, in the barn with the horses and the hay. It's locked up. So now we have to try to break into that to get what we call a golden ticket image to be able to authenticate people, and we lose days doing that. Back that up to something like Azure AD, some outside thing. Same with the logs. And then, core to your point is an out-of-band communications method. So email may be up, you're unsure if they're in email. We would advise clients, don't talk about what you're going to pay maybe, or your insurance coverage limits in those communications, or anything really tactical. Keep that out of band. But email may also be down. And so it doesn't have to be terribly fancy. It can just be setting up a multi-factor G Suite, that is, back-end monitored by IT. Set this up before anything happens. You understand how, from a compliance standpoint, you would, retain records. You don't want people mixing it with their personal communications. So these are some of the tactical things that we think about.
Yep. All right. We've just been joined by Dominique, who I'm sure was handling a crisis, which is why she's a little late. Dominique, we're just chatting a little bit, but maybe just give a quick introduction for yourself, and then we'll get you looped in.
Yeah, so Dominique, Shelton, Leipzig. I'm a privacy and cybersecurity partner at Perkins Coie, and I do chair the firm's global data innovation team.
Awesome. So we're just talking about operational security concerns, and Dan, I think about when I think about all the things that Luke said, right? You need sort of some runway to get prepped. So maybe take us a step back, right, and think about the two most significant levers, right, in every ransomware attack are BCDR, right, and then data exfiltration, right? And so as you think about prepping in those two categories, you can pick one, and I'm going to hand the other one to Dominique. So you get to pick first. Pick one of those and just talk a little bit about what strategies you should be thinking about for each of those, so that when both levers are pulled by the ransomware bad guy, you've got some preparation in each of those two different domains.
Yeah, it's great. I'll jump into sort of the ransomware response in line with the global titles here. There's conversations to be had, right? Along with talking about that incident response and that preparation that Chris mentioned, and sort of having that information separate and available for the communications plan that Luke mentioned. You're either consolidating that into an incident response plan or a business continuity plan, and having those appendix that have, the cell phone numbers or someone else's printed out information so folks can actually communicate, especially in this distributed workforce in response. But also talking to, and this will get into governance a little bit, but talking to your board, talking to your executive leadership on what is your anticipated response to a ransom demand. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to make some commitments up front, but also walking through the different, attenuating circumstances or the details of a potential exfiltration and what kind of information may be tied up in that to understand what your position is ahead of time. Slightly, adjoining to that is preparing communications, external facing communications, internal communications. I think every executive leader can, and every lawyer can do with a little PR training, being able to walk through and be prepared with some of that templatized language so that they're ready in those moments when they're still trying to get counsel on the line. Let's say they're still trying to talk to their carrier, but they're getting questions early and often, either from really valued partners or internal staff, that they aren't saying anything that accidentally includes a legal determination or any other language that we would then advise them you're going to want to retreat from that. But now we have communication issues to address right off the bat. So a couple of thoughts around what you can do in ransomware. Yep. Be prepared from the executive side of things.
Yep. And then Dominique, I mean, you have the unique perspective of have a fairly significant privacy practice and thinking about the data mapping, but how does that exercise that you've maybe undertaken, right? So some clients have done a pretty sophisticated email. How does that how key is that in the ransomware context in particular? And then how do you leverage that in an incident?
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out business continuity and planning, and just knowing where your data is so important in that, and also how actionable the data is. So even when data has been mapped, say pursuant to a NIST or a privacy exercise, sometimes clients have found they're not able to actually implement and use that data and get it out of cold storage for sometimes weeks and weeks or months. So even though it was what might have been, totally acceptable for BCDR, is going to be unacceptable when it's necessary to stand up the business right away. So couldn't agree more with what Dan said in terms of this dovetails in with the types of things that the board and the C-suite should be asking in terms of how actionable that BCDR really is.
Right, exactly. One thing I would say is, like when I just had a conversation, interesting, we did a tabletop exercise, which we'll come to in a second. We did a tabletop exercise with a client, and they said, one of the questions was, they have branches, essentially like local stores, and each of them has its own NAS, and each of them has different data that's on the NAS. And one of the questions they said was like, how are we going to know what data is impacted at a store level? Because we don't do data mapping at the store level. Yes, we do it at corporate, but we don't do it at each of the different branches. It's just too hard. And how important is that? And one of the things we talked about is what are your strategies going to be? Because each store is not exactly the same, right? You may have some governance policies in place around what information the store should keep, how long they should keep it, things to do, things not to do. But at the end of the day, each store is going to be unique, and you have to be able to say, okay, I have a general sense for what's there. We haven't done that type of detailed data mapping, but I can leverage our governance policy, our policies around what data should be kept and retention to say, this is what I expect to be there, right? So that when you figure out the data has been exfiltrated in your ransomware attack, right, you at least have some idea, right? And I think that's what you're getting at, Dominique, which is like that data mapping you can leverage pretty heavily if you've done it. And if you haven't done it, then you rely on your governance and your policies to at least get some corners around what might be impacted.
Precisely. Exactly.
Yeah.
And, to your point, as you were mentioning, Aravind, and it's so important to be able to have a handle on what's going on, and being prepared ahead of time, not in the midst of a crisis where you've got press and customers and employees panicking. It's great to have the stuff done ahead of time.
Yep. I want to go back to BC for just a second and just ask an open question. Everybody's got a BC plan. Everyone's got a DR plan, or at least you should have one, right, that you can leverage. One of the challenges I've seen is clients who get into a situation, they're like, oh, our BC DR plan's great. We can bring it up in 2 hours. And then somebody saying, well, but we've never practiced that.
Right.
So maybe, Dan, let me pick up back with you for a second. Just talk about how fundamentally important that is in the process of sort of preparing for that eventuality.
Yeah, Chris said it well. It's the word communications. So right up front, I think of communications and expectation setting. When we're talking to our clients about what their incident response looks like, one of their foremost things is, well, business continuity. I need to know, reputational harm, ransom payments, other things, but really how long until I'm up and running again. And that's a question that, on the best of days, you'll hear, oh, we'll be up in 2 hours. And then it's like, well, have you tried restoring from backups? Do you know what that process really looks like? If you're talking about a decryption key, do you have, some understanding about what application of that key will look like? And I think it is just that we're starting to see that bleed into, and that training on business continuity plans as much as IR plans. So at least we have some open communication and expectation setting across leadership so that they understand. To harp back to those clients that have distributed workforce in stores, those stores, you might not be able to train them up on everything that you'd hope they would do. They're not going to have a CTO or CISO in each one of those stores, or the management that's capable of it. But whether that management hears really firm command of the situation because they understand what business continuity will look like and what the incident response plan dictates, I think you can have a much stronger response. You don't have maybe that sense of panic, or someone posting a note on the front of the store like, we've been hacked, we're down, and then photo snapped and then it's on social media and you have a whole other problem. So I think really to oversimplify it a little bit, if you take it back to training off of it and setting those expectations, then you can have a leadership that's more informed and more capable in the response.
I think it's a great point. I think that's a great point. I'm gonna shift to leadership, and then I'm gonna start with Luke, and then I'm gonna come to you, Chris. But one thing I think is fair, right, Dan, and I think you've indicated this, and I think all of us have had this experience, is that the ransomware issue has gotten us in front of more boards of directors than I think ever before, right? Like, I think if I were to look back on the practice 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking to boards on a fairly regular basis. It was never at this cadence. Like, when I have the same client who wants me to speak to their board every quarter for a year, right? So maybe Luke, pick up on that and just talk about why that interest, where is that coming from, and then just kind of kick us off in a conversation around the board's particular interest in ransomware.
Yeah, thank you, Aravind. And just before this thread leaves my mind on the BCP-DR piece, one of the key difference makers here is this is not like failing over after a hurricane.
Right.
So normal recovery time objectives are basically out the window. When the music stops, certain percentage of your environment is encrypted and you've taken the rest offline proactively. You're bringing everything back through a sieve, through a funnel. It's being cleared one and two at a time by, a forensic team. So it is not the same as everything failing back over within 4 hours or 10 hours. So that means, what are we going to bring back first, second, and third? So having a prioritized list that takes into account not only what we'd wish come back first, but what's dependent on what other things before it actually can come back. And I've described what I call the cyber hunger games in this before, where people fight to the death to get their line of business up and running before that one. This can all be mapped out ahead of time, and you can build a prioritized list. On governance, this is now, the biggest risk issue. ESG is coming up, in the rearview mirror, catching up to us, occupying board time. For me, ransomware is like the icebreaker that gets us in the room with the board. And then what they're thinking about most of the time is the payment decision and the sanctions issue, perhaps. But there's a whole host of other things that they usually haven't, they haven't had hopefully the chance to experience in real life, that you're able to take them into the view of the storm on operational risk decisions, the types of really challenging communications points that Dan alluded to. So it's a whole of organization risk. It's totally necessary, not even just appropriate or nice, but absolutely expected for the board to be engaged, senior management. These are risk choices, whole of business risk choices that cannot be ceded to the IT or InfoSec department.
Yeah. Chris, you want to add to that?
Yeah, very much. And just to add even a wrinkle to it, and that is what I've seen increasingly, is it's not just one board. And going back to what I said earlier, the identifying those stakeholders, I didn't say shareholders, stakeholders, the people who are the decision makers, because a number of times I've seen a major North American entity with the leadership all on the call, all making decisions about operationality and concluding, well, we have no backups, or our backups are tape backups that can only be restored sequentially. So we're going to pay, and then finding out that they have to get approval from, say, a parent company in APAC, or finding out they're in the middle of an acquisition and nobody's quite sure who owns the assets. That's a very, very common occurrence these days. And there are corporate cultural differences. So from a North American company to a Japanese parent, for example, where now you've gotten a commitment to pay, you're telling the threat actor, getting them to that number, and suddenly the Japanese parent says, we will never pay. You will never pay as a subsidiary of ours. And now you have headbutting that has to go in asynchronous hours. There's a lot to be thought about there. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think you raise a couple interesting questions. So let me just try to let's tease some of these things out. So this is the question I get all the time, Dominique, which is, who gets to make the call to pay or not to pay? Is it my CEO? Does she get to make the call? Is it my CFO? or is it the board? And maybe just, and I know every organization is different, but just what's some of the considerations that go into organizations deciding where, or determining, I guess because it's two different parts, where that decision should lie?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I am seeing this happen a lot in terms of payment thresholds and payment amounts. So under a certain, 8-figure amount, that could be a decision that's made by the GC and the CEO without board approval. Mm-hmm. Over a certain amount, we're starting to see boards wanting to know about that, and certain, higher 8 figures, low 9 figures, wanting to have board approval. And so we're seeing all this laid out in a board level ransomware incident response plan. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to just, point out even a little bit further the opportunities here on the cyber preparedness side that companies are pivoting to, just to sort of piggyback off of what Chris is saying, beyond what is just there in the moment, but also looking ahead for continued board involvement and board level oversight, as well as C-suite oversight over the cyber preparedness in general. So I'm seeing that trend also happen.
Yeah, totally right. I think the key is making sure you have that discussion early, so that that group of stakeholders from the board all the way down to the C-suite know who is going to be making that decision under what circumstances, right? And your discussion of sort of like, look, we look at it as a basic materiality consideration and make like all board decisions and all executive management. If it's material, the board has to make that consideration. If it's not material, then the executive, and that's a lot of them do it. But Dan, like when you have that conversation with the board and try to think about like what's in the best interest of the company, right? What are some of the challenges with the board making that decision versus the CEO and having her make that decision versus having the GC make that decision or the CISO? So like what are some of the challenges for those different groups in making that? Because that's the other question, like who's the best situated to make that call?
Yeah, I'll try not to get myself in trouble, but sometimes it's attention span, and it's bandwidth. Mm-hmm. Right. Ability to really be in and knowledgeable and sort of see what it constitutes materiality in the short term versus the long term. And as I said before, even sketching that out, sometimes once it's actually happened, and to Luke's point, you can plan all you want, but then when it's happening, it suddenly becomes real. And you have a different conversation of like, oh God, we got to pay, or oh, absolutely not, we can't. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is just trying to understand and sitting alongside, sometimes in a smaller conversation with the executive team or with the board, to say, really, how familiar are you with these situations? Let's walk through some hypotheticals. It's a tabletop exercise exclusively for the board sometimes, to just help them understand what they're looking at so that they can either come to the realization themselves that they don't have necessarily all of the facts they need. Hopefully you lead that horse to water and they drink, but sometimes it's also, being able to then do the same with the C-suite team to understand where they have that familiarity, and they will come to say, guide this decision one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes it's just through that, the hypotheticals, the walkthroughs that helps dictate what's material and who is going to be in that decision seat or that determination seat when the time comes.
Yeah. So you raised another point that's good. Maybe Chris, I'll get you to chime in on this first, but this is a question I get asked all the time. And before I tell you what my view is, I want to get your view. Should we have a policy around whether we pay ransomware or not? Like I get that question all the time. It's like, should we have a policy that we will pay or we won't pay? And maybe just chime in on what your thoughts are, and then I'll let everyone kind of give a thumbs up or thumbs down on where they come at that. Because that's I think we all say like the board wants a policy, so I can just follow the policy and it's super easy. But what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I am not in favor of policy on that, and not because I don't want it to be considered, and I want it to be recorded that it's been considered. That's not the issue. Mm-hmm. The issue is the fluidity of these situations. For example, my backup solution works just fine. I can restore it very quickly. Okay, great. Well, it turns out that no, this 0-day vulnerability was in your backup system. And instead of moving all the backups to a DMZ, that was then put into a secure hold or some kind of asynchronous backup, you now have a situation where no, your backups weren't good. So is if the policy says we do not pay, wonderful. That's I can sneak preview and say it's always going to say do not pay. But now you're in a situation where you're going to send home 6,000 employees and tell them go find other jobs. You're done. You're wrapping it up. You have nothing more to work off of. Have a nice day. I guarantee you're going to revisit that policy, and now you have a policy in writing that, God forbid, is put on the stand in front of you one day in some kind of proceedings. Well, here this is your standard of care, right? That's one of the reasons we don't like to deliver recommendations after an incident in writing. We prefer to do it verbally. We don't want to create that standard of care. So I have a real problem with the policy. Though I like it, I wouldn't recommend it.
Right. I see everybody nodding their head sort of to that question. So I'm just going to, anybody disagree with that? Anybody have like a different view? Yeah.
I mean, I think if you're going to have one, Aravind, it shouldn't start out with it's our policy to pay ransoms. I just wouldn't start out with that.
Right.
You might start out with it's our policy not to pay a ransom unless, and then like really self-servingly, in our customer's best interest in the business, all of that. But to me, it's way more important, and I think this goes to something Dominique said, is to have the criteria we are going to consider, because we all know about the fog of war and a cyber incident. So, we know the checklist of items that OFAC, for example, has outlined. We know, what we're going to want to know apart from that. What are the things we're going to make sure we've answered each of these fact questions? Because to Chris's point, these are very fact-dependent, fluid situations. So it's impossible to predict. One ransomware group is not the same as another. One set of cards where the music stopped is not the same. But these are the factors we're going to consider. And these are the people that are going to be involved in the decision. Like, we're not going to issue a payment without the GC, because no matter if it's $5 million or $500, there are reputational and legal consequences. So that to me is more important than a policy statement.
So what kinds of tools have you developed that can help guide that process? And I'll describe some of the things I've heard and some of the things that we've done, but get your input onto sort of what you like to do. Like we've helped clients develop ransomware decisioning matrices, right? Ransomware decisioning trees, right? To the point that you just made, Luke, and picked up on, like a checklist of considerations and factors. Like clients, there's a variety of different ways to skin the cat, right? And we've developed all of them, but personal preference, like what have you found, Dominique, for example, is the most helpful in giving the client a tool that allows them to go through this process, doing the things that Luke's just described, which is making sure I've considered all the different things, I've gone through the right process. Like what's your favorite way to develop a tool? Is it a matrix? Is it a tree? Like what do you use?
Yeah, so the decision-making matrix, where depending on the cost threshold, the ability to stand up the data that's needed, as well as looking to what vendors, digital wallets, all that stuff, putting all of that in place ahead of time so that if a decision needs to be made to pay the ransom, which is obviously not ideal, but if clients are there, that they're in a position to execute. We have seen some situations where after going through the whole matrix, the client is prepared to, the company is prepared to make a decision to pull the trigger and make a payment, and just finds they don't have the capacity to do so because of all of the changes that have been happening at the financial institution level to even turn liquid into a digital currency, period. So these are all the things that I think are helpful to actually have written down. And the board level incident response plan is one that we have found very useful, so that there's not pushback when management comes in and needs to make a decision.
Yeah. Dan, do you have a favorite tool like that you help clients build in order to help them? Like, Dominique uses the matrix and an incident response plan. Do you have something that's your favorite?
We follow the decision tree model more often just because of its approachability for a lot of folks. And because to the point of whether you're considering a policy or a matrices or a decision tree, it needs constant updating. The rapid change in the ransomware landscape, the threat actors, what we're seeing from regulators means that you have to revisit this in a way that most policies, frankly, aren't revisited. They get a little stale. They're a couple of years old sometimes when they're coming back up for review, or if they're not annually, even, it can be a problem. So it's also getting the buy-in to say, if we're going to use a decision tree or matrices, if we're going to put this in a policy, let's make sure that we have something that is going to be somewhat iterative to a point, because we have to keep up with these shifting sands of the different contexts and considerations, including things like, I think important to that is what your coverage looks like and allows, what an acquisition or a merger means. There's a lot of different things that can change internally that also need to be contemplated in such a tool.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Can we let's talk about, now you've got these tools, or you're developing these tools. Let's talk about training for a minute, right? And I think I've been doing this incident response forum for a long time, and I remember, I don't think a single panel has gone by where we don't talk about a tabletop exercise. So let's just talk about that for a second, so that we can make sure we check that box in this panel. But just maybe, Luke, when you're doing the tabletop exercises, we've all sort of been through those. We kind of all know what they are. But when you're doing a ransomware specific one, right? And that's been, by the way, I think soup du jour over the last 12 months. Everyone wants to do a ransomware tabletop exercise. Give me the one key thing, and I'm going to ask everybody the same question so you all get prepared for it. What's the one thing that you make sure that you've incorporated into your tabletop exercise, because you see it as sort of, that's the key friction, right? And that's the place to train on. So if there's one thing, and I'm going to let everybody chime in on this, but Luke, you're on the spot first. What's the one thing you want to make sure you incorporate into every tabletop exercise?
Yeah, I think it's to instill in them how essential it is to have a cross-functional approach. Our clients, like everyone on here, they don't hire us when they're not sophisticated to begin with. So they are people who are top in their area, but the hackers and the ransomware groups live in the silos. They live in gaps, international gaps between countries, but they take advantage of gaps between organizational functions. So are we getting legal eyes in at the right time? Are we, if several yellow flags come in at the first response level, are we able to correlate those? Somebody tells the marketing team, we're getting suspicious emails from your domain. Over here, we have these yellow flags. Are we able to timely correlate those and escalate in a cross-functional way? I've seen it so many times where it stays in IT or information security too long, it becomes a big issue. Or increasingly in ransomware, as you know, the market is stratified on the bad guy side, and there are now access brokers whose job is not to carry out the attack, but to get the digital foothold, the door stopper, if you will, in the network. And so if we can't spot that in the weeks or a month or two before we finally get hit, if we don't connect those dots cross-functionally early enough and take the proper steps, we can't really meaningfully avert the disaster that's coming at us. So when we do a tabletop, it is all about impressing on people the cross-functional part. So they may ask, and last thing I'll say, can I just be in for my part? Well, you're missing a lot of the benefit when you don't understand how your part fits with the other people's parts. Why do they need to have this from you at a certain time? How does this marry up with all of the reality cross-functionally?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Chris, how about you?
So I'm actually going to choose to talk about the technical side of things here, being the technical guy here. And one of the big things I try to do is just, first of all, very often the companies are, and especially in an immature IT group, or frankly, even very often in mature IT groups, you'll see over-reliance on a tool. We have X product. Well, I'm here to tell you, there is no such thing as the X product that works. It's how you use that X product and who's watching it. Do you go to sleep at night? I kind of assume you do. Well, Russia's awake when you're asleep. So where do those alerts go? So very much in the tabletop exercise from a technical perspective, what I like to do is make sure I pick the product they are centrally relying on for security. Hey, we have a cool EDR product with lots of X's and predatory animals named after it, so it's got to be great. It says it's going to do everything. I take it. I usually have a lot of cheating material from live scenarios, by the way, so this helps a lot. And then I subvert it. I use that as the attack vector, which we've seen, right? And then and talk about how it can potentially fail and why you need to do defense in depth. That's all a way of getting in. And frankly, with the eyes that light up very often there on even the non-technical folks, you start to be able to get better traction to explain, okay, now let's talk about real security and real incident response.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. How about you, Dan?
I'll sort of stem off of what Chris is saying. On the technical side, I always like to highlight in that scenario, who are your key or your high risk employees from your tech side, right? Who has admin privileges, who, especially for our less sophisticated teams, making sure that there's eyes on that and that some leadership understand the criticality of some of those individuals and or what they mean is and avoiding things like a key man scenario where you have real issues related to how those privileges are being used, or even if they're aware that such admin privileges have such rights. And then on the other side, to endorse Dominique's earlier point of going a little bit through the BDR, talking through what systems are you prioritizing how, so that they have that realization that the two are so tightly bound together to understand what standing back up will look like while we're walking through everything else on the forensic investigation side.
Yep. No, I think that's, these are all really good points. Dominique, I'm going to let you have the second to last word. Oh, you're still there.
I was on mute. Yeah, I've just been really focusing these days a lot on the board incident response plan and the incident tabletop exercise with the board, so they can be effective interlocutors in a situation like this. We've created a board level checklist about the types of questions that are appropriate for the board to pose. And which ones seep more into the management of the actual incident, which is often where we don't want board members and C-suite to be. So thinking a lot about those things, and also to Dan's point, Luke's point, Chris' point, your point, finding an integrated way to have the different parts of the business to be communicating, and certainly to at least follow the various incident response plans out there. Because what we're also seeing with our litigation teams on the flip side is when those plans are not followed, that creates the litigation risks and issues later. So really trying to make sure people are looking at the document that we spent all this time working on together.
No, so it's so funny, right? How many tabletop exercises have you done and nobody ever pulls out the incident response plan? And it's always sort of funny, right? I mean, somebody eventually will do it, but oftentimes I've done it and no one touches the IR plan, even though it was sent beforehand, like it's part of the package that we send. Yeah. Let me. Here was one that I'll offer. One of the things that we try to do to get to this sort of policy question of like, do you want to have a policy not to pay? We try to simulate a scenario where we're really juxtaposing the conflicting interests that force you to make that hard decision. Right. And so one of the things that we've done is, because everybody says, okay, here's the process we would go through. We would engage the firm. We would talk about these things. We would figure out with our carrier, can we pay? They do all those things, but they never get to that decision of like, will I pay or not pay? And so one of the things that we've done is think about, how do I take the conflicting factors? And you all sort of highlighted this, like the business impact piece, the need to be, like, I don't want to send 6,000 employees home, right, Chris? To the data exfiltration piece, the branded reputational piece, the board's considerations that they don't want to pay. We take all of those and try to push them to one central focus point. And then one of the things we've done is we poll them and we say, all right, do you pay or do you not pay? And nobody gets to not raise their hand. You have to raise your hand and say, I'll pay, I won't pay. And then we go through a discussion around, why did you make that decision from some of the key stakeholders, so we can get those ideas out, right? Because there are lots of incidents that will happen. They're all factor suspended, but like sometimes it's like obvious we're not going to pay because we don't need to pay. Like we're fine. Like they stole the data, we know what it is. It's not that big a deal, or we can get our systems back up. But the key is like finding that crucible and putting people into that to realize that like there is a set of facts, right? And I haven't gotten to this point yet in a tabletop exercise where I can force you to pay. Like I can turn a screw. I have to just figure out which one it is beforehand. But the key is for the facilitators to find those screws, figure out how hard to turn them so you can get them where they're in that crucible, and they have to make that decision. And then the key is to have them explain why they're making that decision, right? Because then it gives you all these lessons about, okay, how do I avoid that problem, right? What is the key thing? Okay, so if it's brand and reputational, how do we deal with the brand and reputational impact proactively so that I take that screw and basically unwind it out, right?
So let me jump in and not.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to. I
Yeah,
apologize for trying to be an attention hog here, but I don't think we can end the panel without it mentioning one of those screws, frankly, and that is, let's call it a pressure point, and that is the insurance policy, the insurance coverage, that risk management plan. Because frankly, in many instances we're involved in, that could be the decider. If it's wasted locker, I'm sorry, you're going to go out of business and you don't have the cash on hand and you can't liquidate to get to it, but tough luck. The insurance carriers just sent you a declination letter. Again, so many, and what kind of assets do you have? Do you have cryptocurrency assets as well? Good luck finding coverage, right? The coverage, the gaps that exist in those kind of coverage plans are so often so huge you can drive a truck through it. So that's one of those pressure points I think has turned so many things on its head. And that's another thing that needs to be thought about.
No, totally agree. Let me ask one other question, and we're getting close on time. So there haven't been any questions yet from the audience. So if you've got questions, throw them in the chat, and I'll try to grab them. But let me ask this question because I know it's on the top of everybody's mind. The SEC, right, on all cyber matters. We're not just talking about ransomware here, but the SEC has become incredibly active. And I'm sure that my colleagues in the panel have all been dealing with requests from the Chicago office about one incident or another. But just for just a second, Luke, maybe you just kick us off in that direction for a second. When you think SEC and the needs to potentially do an early disclosure, how do you work that into part of the training? Because like that impacts communication streams and like the traditional strategy, like, well, I'll wait until I have to say something. Like, how does that impact that potential need to disclose early? How does that impact how you handle it? And then the key question I will have is, do you mention ransomware in your 8K? Like when you do that press, do you have to mention ransomware?
Yeah, I think no matter what, if you're publicly traded in your IRP, you have to build in the check of, do we have MNPI here? Do we need to suspend the trading window for those read into the investigation? We don't want anyone going to prison over this, and even an investigation is really terrible for everyone involved. So we want to deal with that even before we think about what we're going to say publicly. The SEC is laser focused on this area. They've been talking about resilience for several years now, board level and senior management accountability, all sorts of things. Your risk factor disclosures, of course, can no longer be hypothetical. I think to your point, Aravind, we're starting to see more 8Ks in these cases. The ones, we're seeing lately are calling it out as ransomware. It used to be thought of as, a dirty secret. We don't want to use the R word, but to be honest, now it kind of fits a pattern. People understand what it is. It fits a certain pattern. And importantly, they kind of infer what it's not. So it's, I think we're going to see a trend to more 8Ks and more of them calling it ransomware.
Mm-hmm. All right, look, we got 5 minutes left. Let me grab there now that I've invited questions. We got some questions. So let me just throw one. And I think, Dominique, you've articulated this, but one question is, when you do your exec tabletop exercise, do you include the board members in that one, or do you do one that's just for the board alone? Like, how do you handle that?
Yeah, so I've been doing both. So the exec tabletop, separate. And then I like execs to be there when the board tabletop is happening, and also the interplay of when are you going to be, bubbling this up as a CEO to the board, when is the audit committee reporting to the full board, all that stuff. I'd like to have all the players there, but it's almost like, think of a full day exercise, and then you've got 2 hours with just focusing on management, and then 2 hours with the board with some of the key management players there.
Great.
And then also send the CISO and everybody else.
Right. Great. Let me ask Luke. I'm going to pitch one to you that I think is going to sound familiar to both you and I from our federal prosecutor background. Government engagement pre-ransomware attack. Just talk a little bit about, like, do you create a relationship with the FBI? Is that the one you want? Do you want to create a relationship with CISA? Right? Is that the relationship you want? And then maybe just a couple words on why you want to create that engagement.
Yeah, you either need to have the relationships with CISA and FBI, especially FBI in my view, or you need to have access to vendors and folks, like everyone here who has many years of those connections. I think it'd be very unwise not to include a check-in with FBI as one of your factors in your ransomware payment protocol or decision matrix. You don't want to just rely on the OFAC list, and you also want to know what the track record of this group is. I think that's essential. In terms of the Treasury, we've had instances where we've had to go to them in light of the brand new guidance, and try our best to inoculate the client and the vendors involved by saying, here's the situation. It is like 3 steps removed from wasted locker, to Chris's point, where there's other whiff of smoke around here. It's not for routine cases. It's for cases where you have a reason to believe you may be dealing with a sanctioned group.
Right. And I know that we're going to talk, I know there's going to be a discussion, it's going to get really deep into the OFAC issues, but there's a question in the chat that picks up on that, Luke, and I'll chime in and add one more thing to what you said, which is technically there's a license process. You can go to OFAC and ask for a license. Now that's what created, so back about 18 months ago, as a lot of you know, somebody went to OFAC and asked for a license to deal with a threat actor, and that's actually what started a lot of this, right? And I remember talking to Bill at Coveware about that issue back in June when we were wrapped up in that same mess, that somebody had gone and asked OFAC, and OFAC went crazy and then was sort of screaming at everybody, shut everything down. But you can technically go ask for a license, right? But I do think that, Luke, the idea of having relationships with people at OFAC, or yourself having that, right, can facilitate that discussion, because there may theoretically be a life and death situation or a perilous situation where you need to work with them. And then, and just if you're incorporated into critical infrastructure, right, as some part of critical infrastructure, then you have the opportunity to leverage CISA in that kind of conversation. So Bruce has showed up, which means I think we're going to get the cane. It's good to see you again, Bruce. I'll just say my last party shot. It's great to talk to all of you. I know we get to run into each other sometimes doing work, but it's great to see all of you. I hope this was helpful for the audience. And want to just thank Bruce for giving us the opportunity to sit here and chat with you guys for 50 minutes.
Thanks, Aravind. Great job. The bad actors tried to take me out, but I paid the ransom and I am back. So let's go.
Nice recovery, Bruce.
Nicely done, yeah.
And Chris, Dominique, Luke, thank you so much for participating. It was a great panel. And our next panel is in 5 minutes. It's on ransomware and cyber insurance. So please join us in 5 minutes. Thank you.